So in this video lecture we're going to talk about the selection entitled Hedonism from John Stuart Mill's book Utilitarianism. We're going to focus on his response to Bentham, and we're going to talk about some of the main moves that he makes in his arguments in this selection. So the first one, like Bentham, he talks about utility in terms of pleasure. So the greatest happiness principle, as he puts it on page 258, is that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. And happiness, in his definition, is pleasure and the absence of pain. And he argues that these are the only things that are desirable as ends. This is the foundation of morality, the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Now the question is going to be what he means by pleasure and what he means by pain. And one of the criticisms of utilitarianism is that this is a doctrine worthy only of swine, is how Mill puts it. In other words, that it's a philosophy for pigs. So if you say the highest good is pleasure, you're suggesting that a person should only devote themselves to indulging their senses, eating and drinking, lying around, watching TV, not doing anything really significant or worthwhile. And where's the concern with the good, with virtue, things like that? That's the objection here. And you'll remember this was an objection that was made to Epicurus's philosophy as well. So how does Mill reply to this? Well, he argues that people making this accusation think that utilitarianism is degrading to the human. It treats us as if we're nothing more than animals, nothing more than beasts. And Mill's response is actually the people making the objection are the ones who are degrading the human being, since they're suggesting that we're only capable of the kinds of pleasures that pigs are capable of. Mill argues that, in fact, we have higher faculties, higher capabilities that go beyond mere sensation. We don't live just by our senses and by sensory pleasure. Instead, we also have intellect. We have feeling. We have imagination. We have moral sentiments. And so, a being, this is how he puts it on page 259, a being of higher faculties requires more to make him happy, is capable probably of more acute suffering, and is certainly accessible to it at more points than one of an inferior type. But in spite of these liabilities, he can never really wish to sink into what he feels to be a lower grade of existence. So Mill thinks that we have a sense of dignity that comes with being human, and we can't really respect ourselves or feel really satisfied or content if we were just to spend our lives lying on the couch, eating, drinking, watching TV, not doing anything that engages these higher faculties. Now, if Mill has responded to the accusation of these critics, he's also going to respond to an argument of Bentham. As we've seen, Jeremy Bentham thinks that the only differences between pleasures are quantitative, not qualitative. So in other words, that means that it's just a matter of degree rather than kind. So the differences that matter between pleasures, say Pac-Man or philosophy or pushpin or poetry, the only differences is the degree or the amount, the quantity of pleasure that you get from it. One isn't a better kind of pleasure than another. Bentham thinks that whichever one gives you more pleasure, well, that's the better pleasure. He doesn't think that one is intrinsically more valuable or worthwhile. So in other words, for Bentham, some pleasures are more desirable than others because they're stronger or more intense, not because they're qualitatively higher or better. Who's to say which is better? That's the big question. So Mill argues in response that some kinds of pleasures are in fact more desirable and more valuable than others. They're not merely more intense, it's not that they're just more fun, but they're actually better, they're of higher quality. So the question is, who says? Who's to say that one is better? Bentham really didn't like the idea that some snobbish people could say more refined pleasures are better than others. He thought that was unfair. So who gets to say which pleasures are higher? Isn't it just a matter of personal preference? Some people like Pac-Man, other people like philosophy, but who's really to say? Mill's reply to this question is this. If I'm asked what I mean by difference of quality in pleasures, or what makes one pleasure more valuable than another, merely as a pleasure, except its being greater in amount, there is but one possible answer. Of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experience of both give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that's the more desirable pleasure. So you have to say, let's compare Pac-Man and philosophy. You have to look to a person who has experience of both. And if the person who has experience of both really chooses one clearly over the other, not because they think it's the right answer, that they have some obligation to prefer it, but because it's more desirable, that's the better pleasure. So it's a matter, in other words, of informed opinion. The person or persons with informed opinion are those who are able to adjudicate. They're the ones who are able to compare the pleasures and decide which is better. So he says, now it's an unquestionable fact that those who are equally acquainted with and equally capable of appreciating and enjoying both do give a most marked preference to the manner of existence which employs their higher faculty. Few human creatures would consent to be changed into any of the lower animals for a promise of the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasures. No intelligent human being would consent to be a fool. No instructed person would be an ignoramus. No person of feeling and conscience would be selfish and base, even though they should be persuaded that the fool, the dunce, or the rascal is better satisfied with his lot than they are with theirs. So those beings who have higher faculties need more to be happy. And this is a famous line that Mill offers. It's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it's because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides. So that's why it's so important that you have informed opinion, the person who has experience of both, because only they can compare. So if I've only played Pac-Man and then I take one philosophy class and I say, well, Pac-Man is obviously better than philosophy, I haven't quite learned just from taking one class of the full pleasures of philosophy. I have to have experience of each in order to really be able to say so. I need to finish that course and study it in a little more depth in order to start to appreciate those higher pleasures. Another example, you could compare it, someone who only eats, say, McDonald's, and then you ask them if McDonald's tastes better than a healthy homemade meal. The person whose taste buds are attuned or sensitive to McDonald's food, they're going to say, I don't want to eat all that, those vegetables and, that meat and stuff. I'd rather have a Big Mac. But it takes some time for their taste buds to be attuned to the pleasures that come with eating, good homemade food. And so the person who's experienced both is the one who's able really to say which is better food, not the person who only knows one side of it, and the person who only knows the Big Mac. So here's another objection. Mill thinks that human beings never desire anything but happiness, again defined as pleasure in the absence of pain. Is that true? Is it true that we never desire anything but pleasure? Can we prove it? Some critics argue that we desire other things like money, power, fame. Mill's reply is that we want these things because they lead to happiness, because we think that they're pleasant. They're a means to an end. Now he acknowledges sometimes they become part of the end, in the sense that they're principal ingredients of the individual's conception of happiness. So that person envisions the happy life as one of being rich and powerful and famous. And so we desire these things as part of happiness, maybe. Not merely as a means, but as part of the end. So what about virtue then? Mill says that virtue is a good of this description. Like money and power and fame, we desire it maybe as a means to an end, the end of happiness, and maybe it reaches a point where we actually desire virtue as part of the end, as part of our vision of happiness, of the good life. So one question we might ask here is whether that makes virtue just sort of an optional feature, like money or power. It seems to make it something optional. So if you want virtue, well, sure, then it can be an ingredient in happiness. But if you don't really care about being virtuous, then it doesn't matter. So that's something to consider, whether it's treating virtue as really integral to happiness the way someone like Aristotle does. Mill writes, those who desire virtue for its own sake desire it either because the consciousness of it is a pleasure, or because the consciousness of being without it is a pain, or for both reasons united. And so the reason that anyone would ever want virtue is because it's pleasant. They want it because it feels good to be virtuous. It feels bad to be vicious and corrupt. And so it's still, the principle still holds that we want it because it's pleasant. So one last objection in relation to this point. Somebody might ask, well, what about those times when we do something because we think it's the right thing to do, even though it might be unpleasant? Sometimes we do things that are difficult or costly, even painful to us. It's not really what we want to do, but we do it because we think it's the right thing to do. What would Mill say to that? Well, this is where Mill is going to appeal to the importance of the will and of habit. He says there are times when we only choose or will to do the right thing because of habit. We tell the truth because we have formed this habit that we need to tell the truth, and we can't feel good about ourselves or what we've done if we lie about it. And so we formed a habit of trying to do the right thing. And out of that habit, we make a choice. Our will chooses. Now, he acknowledges there are times when we don't really feel like doing the right thing. We don't desire it for its own sake. In fact, we only desire it because we will it. So we choose it, we choose to tell the truth, and out of that choice, we desire the act of being truthful. Nevertheless, Mill argues that desire is still behind all of this habit and willing. He says will is the child of desire. So desire gives birth to the will. And it's only possible to will to be virtuous because we have some kind of desire for virtue. So the desire for the pleasure of virtue is really what's most fundamental. That's rooted in the perception that virtue is in some way going to be pleasant, and the absence of virtue is unpleasant. And so ultimately, it's still that desire for pleasure that underlies even the decision to do the right thing, to pursue virtue. This is an idea that we're going to see challenged in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. So we can think about that when we get to Kant, how this is different. And you can also think about how this is similar to and different from what we see in Aristotle's virtue ethics. So more material for discussion there.